Hey guys, it's Victoria. I'm going to be presenting on Chapter 8 of Women Will Vote, titled Rising from the Ashes of Defeat, the Women's Suffrage Victory in New York State. So the first part of the chapter was titled The 1915 Campaign. So it's talking about the first referendum here. And Carrie Chapman Catt organized what she called a Victory in 1915 Empire State Campaign. And practically all the state suffrage societies, like the clubs and everything, pledged support to this campaign. And a lot of the clubs that gave their support changed their name to party to just give a more political feel to it, kind of. And so one of the things that they did during this time was they worked even harder to gain more men followers at this time. And they did things that they hadn't really done before. Like they would go to places of employment that at the time seemed like improper for a woman to go. Like she shouldn't be there. And they did this because they wanted a range of working men's support. And there was a few different reasons for it. One example that you can find on page 164 if you're following along in the book. It was said by Mary Garrett Hay. She said, "Make friends with the police in the event of trouble." So they had a lot of different reasons. Like they obviously wanted the men to support them and vote yes for their right to vote, but they also knew they might need them for other reasons. And another thing that they did during this time was they really saturated every county of New York State with speakers that would talk about suffrage. They wanted the whole state to know what they were about. And so the campaign was already in pretty good terms with Protestant, people of the Protestant religion. And that was because of the work with the Women's Christian Temperance Union, like their past work. But she wanted to appeal to everyone, not just the Protestants. So she would, not her, but speakers would go to houses of worship in different counties, and they would just talk to the people there. So this included Catholics, Protestants, and Jewish people, not just the Protestants. And so then on election eve, the Men's League helped to march and create rallies. And there was so much support and so many people out on the streets, it gave a feeling that they were going to be successful and win. But unfortunately, they did lose the referendum by about 200,000 votes out of the 1.2 million casted. Earlier that day, it even felt like they were going to win because the mayor of New York City and the governor of the state announced that they would vote. So they had these big political people behind them. They just didn't get to quite enough men. And when they looked at where their support was and where the most votes that they got were, overall, they won where their organization was strongest. So it showed that what they were doing was working. They just didn't have enough of it, and they just didn't reach enough people yet. So the next part is called Changing the New York State Constitution. So after they lost, Harriet Burden Laidlaw said, "Who will come with me?" and start a new campaign in the streets. And the chapter talks about it. Women did come out and they said that they were gonna still fight. They didn't let their feelings go down. They stayed very optimistic about it. And another suffragist that stayed optimistic was Mary Garrett Hay. She said it was a great day in New York. 500,000 men saw their duty and did it. And with the first referendum, 42% of men voted yes. And then a lot of men just left the vote blank. So they either didn't know enough about it or they just were unsure. And the suffragists really saw that as an opportunity to gain more votes. At least they didn't say no. They just left it blank. And Carrie Chapman Catt, she was the president of the New York State Women's Suffrage Association. So she created what she called a winning plan. And her idea was she wanted to contact every single voter in every single county of every single town and city, and she wanted all of them to be educated on suffrage. Because clearly they didn't get to enough people the first time. She wanted every single voter to know about this. And so the new movement was called Victory in 1917. So they took the same name and just changed it to 1917. And with this victory in 1917, they wanted a second referendum. So it had to be resubmitted to state legislature, and it had to pass through there so that they could get it out there for the men to vote. And so in the state legislature, they had Senator George Whitney and Assemblyman Henry Breton, who reintroduced the bill. And it was passed, but the senators tried to block it for a while. But when it was like being stalled, so many male suffragists called the representatives and urged them to vote yes. And with all that support, it did pass through state legislature, sorry. So the next part just talks about like their next steps and everything. So they changed the naming from association to party. So it was now called the New York State Women's Suffrage Party. And Carrie Chapman Catt was still the president, so she was the one that renamed it. She was elected as chair. And it really, changing the name created it to a single organization that had the purpose of a single cause, which was winning votes for women. It wanted to be very specific, sorry. And they did pay a great attention to immigrant and working class and urban upstate and then New York, because there's so many people in New York City. Soon after, in about early 1916, Carrie Chapman Catt actually left. She was asked to take over the role as president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. So she left to more overall, like she went from New York State to like the federal level. And this left Vera Boardman Whitehouse as president. And in her resignation letter, Catt left 3 steps she wanted for New York State. So they're listed as push referendum through 1916 legislation, enroll 1 million women for suffrage, and campaign for more women converts and workers to produce male voters. And then she also said there should just be a focus on education and an organization. And she thought with those steps, New York State could win the fight for suffrage. So then campaigning for 1917, this quote you can find on page 162 if you're following along. By 1916, all 3 major parties included planks favoring women's suffrage as part of their platforms, and although few dared to say it out loud, suffrage in the Empire State seemed inevitable. And at this point in their campaigning, the party had over 1 million due-paying women, so women were paying the party to be a part of it. So they did have a lot of people backing them up. This was probably the most interesting part of the chapter for me. I had no idea this ever happened, and I just think it's so cool that they did this. So the party created mail-ordered suffrage correspondence schools for upstate women that wanted information on how to become suffrage activists. So it was mostly for women in like very rural areas. They couldn't get down to the New York City building where they all were to learn about how to teach others about suffrage, but they wanted to be activists and they wanted to work. So they had to pay 25 cents for tuition, and 12 lessons were mailed to them weekly, and then they would get a test mailed to them monthly. And some of the things that they learned in their lessons was suffrage history and an organization, civic responsibility, public speaking, parliamentary law, and civic government. So it was a really great way of getting women that probably wouldn't have been able to help the suffrage movement become leaders and then gain more followers. And New York State was kind of praised for this idea. A lot of other states then took this idea and used it when they were fighting for suffrage. And there was a lot of articles that came out that talked about like how great of idea to get more rural women helping. And then another thing that the chapter talked about a lot, I don't know if I'm going to say this right, but speakers would canvass to educate the public on suffraging. They talked about it a lot, so it must have been like a new tactic for them, but it was when they would go up to someone's house, knock on the door, and then just educate them. Like they would go directly to someone's house instead of just holding speeches and then hoping people came to them. And so there was a lot of women mentioned in the chapter, but the woman that the chapter kind of focused on was Mary Elizabeth Pidgeon. I don't know if that's how you say her last name. But she worked for the National American Women's Suffrage Association, but she was in New York. And she worked as a paid speaker for a while. And the chapter talked about how great of a job she did at it. She was a great public speaker. She dressed well and looked for the part. Like, she looked professional. And she was educated. She was a teacher before she moved to this field. And then she knew of rural living conditions. So she understood suffrage and she understood what they needed, but she also understood the people that they were trying to teach suffrage about. So she understood the rural life, which made her a really good choice to talk to them about it. She was then promoted to Assembly District Leader in Kanjaya County. I forgot to look up how to say that before doing this. And with that new position, she organized suffrage clubs and worked to gain like a broader acceptance and support of suffrage in her upstate New York County. And so the one thing that the chapter really loved about her was she had diary plans, which included like diary entries and some letters that kept track of her work. And the chapter said that a lot of suffragists didn't do this except for like the very like high up ones, like the names that you most recognize. So seeing someone that worked at more like a county level do this gave a lot of insight on how suffrage was from 1915 to 1917 in New York. Her diary entries were very detailed, so it's helpful to learn about that part of history. And a cool part that the chapter said was like they learned so much. So by the last month of the campaign, there was barely anything in her diary, which showed how hard she was working. The most insightful thing was a letter that she sent to her parents that said she was just tired to death. So these women worked so hard throughout the whole thing to get the vote. And so then the last two parts of the chapter were Victory in the Air and Suffrage Victory in the Empire State. And this really talked about the last few weeks where these women did every single thing that they could, every last push they could do to get through. So they sent postcards to every enrolled member of the party. And it was just urging her to turn in at least one favorable vote for suffrage. So getting someone to go out there and vote yes. And then it gave plans for election day, like what the party was going to be doing that day. And they placed ads everywhere they could about suffrage and the vote. It was on trains, walking through the street, you would just see it, like they were everywhere. And every time they could, they would hand out a piece of literature to whoever took it. And just to give a big idea of how much these women did during the last year, the party printed over 18 million pieces of literature just in the last year for gaining this right to vote. And in the last few weeks, they really had to work to gain money too, because they did so much work throughout the campaign that they pretty much were at zero with their money. So they really had to work hard, not only to gain the vote, but to still raise money to continue working. Another thing that these suffrage leaders did is they went to state military camps and they talked to the men there about suffrage. And they gave out 150,000 cards to men that said, "Stand by the women of your country, they have stood by you." So, like they supported the men during the war and they raised money and they did everything they could for these soldiers. And it's like, we did all this work for you. Now you return the favor and help us gain the right to vote.